Well, we've heard about short-term challenges and long-term opportunities on the road to net zero, and a future where all connected resources can contribute and minimise the cost of the system. That sounds like where we should be heading. So I'm very pleased that the last of our keynote speakers this morning will talk about the next frontiers of energy system decarbonisation in the UK. And that I'm delighted to introduce Julia King, Baroness Brown of Cambridge, who is the chair of the Carbon Trust and also deputy chair of the UK Committee on Climate Change and the UK's Low Carbon Business Ambassador. Julia, please go ahead.
Thank you very much. And actually, this couldn't be a better day, really, for the Carbon Trust to be launching our report on the role of flexibility in the UK energy system, because the International Energy Agency has launched its Global Net Zero Pathways report. And one of the key takeaways it highlights in that report is how electricity system flexibility is going to be becoming more and more important as we approach net zero. So it's a real pleasure for me to be here, essentially giving you a bit of context for the Carbon Trust's report, and also I hope giving you a taster for some of the really interesting detail that both Goran Strabak from Imperial College and Andrew Lever from the Carbon Trust are going to be coming on to next. So here's some context in the UK, which is that the government has now said it accepts the Committee on Climate Change's recommendation for the level of the sixth carbon budget, which takes us out to 2037. That's the first of our six carbon budgets that will be set and will be legislated, which will actually take us on the path to net zero, because the first five carbon budgets were set when our ambition was to get to an 80% reduction. So the Committee on Climate Change's sixth carbon budget report in December 2020 is about the sixth carbon budget, but it's also about the path we need to be on to meet net zero. And where are we starting? Well, the last emissions data we have at the moment for the UK is this from the committee's 2020 report to Parliament to talk about progress. And as you can see, we've been doing quite well in decarbonising our electricity system. That's that red line that's declining steeply. But you can see we have two particularly challenging areas of high emissions, which are the blue line through the middle, which is surface transport, and the orange line, which is declining only very slowly and indeed has flattened off in the last 5 years, which is buildings. And those are two particularly important areas in terms of the need for, but also the opportunities to deliver flexibility. And you'll see that both transport and buildings appear quite significantly in the Carbon Trust's new report. So really, really key and important for our path to net zero. So over the next 30 years, we have got to completely transform our energy system. And it really is quite dramatically different. Today, about 15 to 20% of the energy we use is in the form of electricity, and the rest is in the form pretty much of oil and gas. By 2050, we will be much more efficient. We will use a lot less energy, perhaps as little as half. But the large majority of that will be in the form of electricity, so 65 to 70% of that could be electricity, and a very small amount of that, perhaps 35% in the form of oil and gas, much of that being used still in aviation, but the rest of it being used with carbon capture and storage, and of course some of it contributing to the production of hydrogen. So that really is a very radical change to our energy system, involving a huge growth in our electricity system. And that growth in our electricity system also moves us from probably about 30% renewable generation to about 80% renewable generation. So a very strong dependence on electricity and a very high proportion of renewables. And again, some really interesting challenges of very different challenges in terms of matching demand to supply. And so again, really emphasizing the importance of flexibility. And we have a target now to get from the about 10 gigawatts of offshore wind we have installed today to 40 gigawatts by 2030, and probably in the CCC and our new report, both suggesting somewhere around 100 gigawatts by 2050, and also starting essentially green and blue hydrogen production and getting that to 220 terawatt hours. So getting that to almost the scale of our current electricity consumption, again by 2050. And critically, that the rate of change over the next 10 years has got to be very high indeed. So that the offshore wind going from 10 to 40 gigawatts in the next, well, it's now the next 8.5 years or something. That's a very high rate of change. We're also going to need to see a dramatic change in the way we heat our buildings. So if we're going to get that orange line on the previous chart to be coming downwards rapidly, we've got some 29 million buildings to be installed with low carbon heat. Because at the moment, very little of the heating of our buildings and industrial demand for heat comes from low carbon sources. We're going to see a huge growth in zero carbon vehicles, and also in both public and private charging points. And of course, by 2030, when the ban on sale of new fossil fueled vehicles comes in, the Committee on Climate Change estimates that about 40% of our vehicles by then will be electric. And that implies that if they all, for example, have some 60 kilowatt hours of storage in their batteries, then 15 million vehicles with 60 kilowatt hours of storage, that comes to about 900 terawatt hours of storage being parked for something like 90% of their life. So that's also an enormously important element of thinking about flexibility for the future. And then we're going to have to have negative emissions. It is net zero. We don't get right down to zero. We have to have something taking CO2 out of the atmosphere. That's going to be a lot of planting of new woodland and forests. That means a lot of changes to our farming and our diets to make space for that. But it also means a lot of carbon capture and storage, and probably the development of direct air capture with carbon capture and storage. But of course, we want to do as little of the carbon capture and storage and as little of the direct air capture as we possibly can. And so the way we can optimize the system to reduce our need for that is hugely important. And that's something we also talk about in the report. But it's an enormous amount of change in the next 30 years. And a lot of that change needs to come in the next 10. So I think you'll have got my message that there are some really critical issues to address, and many of those are addressed in the report. So we've got to find cost-effective ways to decarbonize the heating of all of those buildings and for industrial use. We've got to find ways to embed flexibility, both at the level of the grid, but also at the level of our homes, the level of managing demand in our homes through smart appliances, through car charging that can be switched on and off to match demand on the grid. So we need this both at local and at grid level. We need the required level of negative emissions, but we want that to be as low as possible. And we need to use as little hydrogen as possible because it's going to be expensive to make, but the electrolysis could have a role in grid balancing, and of course the blue hydrogen from methane could also have an important role, for example, in energy storage. So what is going to be the most effective role of hydrogen? So these are really some of the really key questions that we need to answer, and we need to answer them in the next 5 years, really. It's very important that we get moving on this. And the message I think you very strongly get from that is that we've got to think of our energy use as a system, because the role of hydrogen is closely linked to how we decarbonize heat. Are we going to have a lot of hydrogen boilers, or are we going to actually manage to do that mostly electrically. But if we decarbonize most of our heat with electricity, then in particular in our homes, that poses real challenges to the grid on those cold winter days when the heat pumps will be being turned up and taking a lot of additional power. How can we use flexibility to shift the demand? How can we use preheating, for example, as a form of demand management? Are we going to end up still burning, I hope not, some methane in order for heat, perhaps in some industrial processes, which would mean that we would need more negative emissions? So flexibility plays an enormously important role in this system, and we cannot think of any of these challenges in isolation. We have to think of them as part of our integrated energy system. So if we take this really integrated approach, and of course it'll be very much enabled by digitalization and big data, but if we take this approach, we can really look at a whole range of effective transition pathways and options for reaching net zero, and we can look at what technologies are ready and what would be cheapest. So it gives us choice, but it enables us also to look at what are the really cost-effective ways to get there. It gives us a more resilient system so that we have more flexibility, more resilience. It gives us a more reliable, potentially, energy system, and we can avoid unintended consequence. It enables us to model and weigh up cost benefits and different regulatory approaches. And it also provides a basis for us to collaborate across different sectors, across the gas, the electricity, the hydrogen, but also the domestic appliances. All of these sectors need to be working together to think, and automotive, crucially as well, automotive and transport, working together to work out how this system delivers the most cost-effective solutions. And really crucial in that, of course, is engaging the customer. Because we as individuals are a hugely important part of this system, and the solutions have to be things that we are comfortable with. So this is a really important report that you're going to be hearing a lot more about the detail of, but you're going to be hearing about the benefits of embedding flexibility, benefits to consumers, benefits to energy security, very significant potential savings up to over 16 billion per annum by 2050. And when you think that the CCC have estimated that we need to be spending about 50, or investing rather, about 50 billion extra per annum in the transition to a low carbon society and a green energy system, 16.7 billion is a very big chunk of that potential reduction, if you like, in the cost and investment needed to get to net zero. A more flexible energy system has so many benefits. It will mean that we actually need to build an awful lot less energy infrastructure, and of course all of that energy infrastructure has embedded carbon in it. So it helps on so many fronts in terms of delivering net zero. But of course, if we're going to have to plug in our cars and be prepared for them to be charged and discharged to help with matching demand with supply, if we're going to be constrained perhaps in when we do our washing, if we're going to have to think about much more about how we heat our homes and how perhaps thermal energy storage can help us to have that heating to be essentially investing in the heating we're going to need when it gets cold in the evenings or something. We're going to have to be operating differently as consumers and homeowners, and we're going to have to be engaged, and there's going to have to see a benefit for us to doing things. So we're going to need all sorts of new business models, but critically engaging the end user as part of how this works. But as you can see, if we can get this right, we use significantly less energy in 2050 than we do today. So there are some real opportunities both for cost savings, but also for some of these new business models to ensure that a whole range of businesses can make money out of delivering the services that people will need. And it's absolutely crucial that we start doing this now, because between now and 2030, we're going to be building up to these 15 million electric vehicles, all of this mobile storage. Between now and 2030, we're going to be building another 30 gigawatts of offshore wind. We're going to be needing to make big changes and investments in the grid. So it's really crucial that we start building in these flexibility options as soon as possible, because it really is a no regrets option. And we really have got to start making sure that people are able to buy and install smart appliances, and that we're increasing building standards appropriately for this new future. Otherwise, there'll be an enormous amount of retrofit to do, because the change has to happen very fast over the next 10 years. So I hope you're looking forward to hearing much more detail about this interesting material and very relevant material that's in our new report. And thank you very much for listening to me.